Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a taboo-challenging podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 143, Pugnacious Preminger.
That's right, we're going to be talking about Otto Ludwig Preminger, the Austrian-American director known for being a bit of a dominating figure, but also making some very interesting and unique and challenging movies and pushing the censorship curtain back off of Hollywood and all sorts of crazy stuff. Had
Sometimes
a very significant
pushing
career.
his actors.
So oftentimes pushing his actors, we'll say. But let's talk about the guy himself a little bit before we get too far into the movies themselves. Otto Ludwig Preminger was born on December 5th in 1905 in a town called Višnitz. That was in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire at the time, but now is part of modern-day Ukraine. He fled a Russian invasion during World War I, and the family as a whole moved to Graz, which was then and then eventually to the Austrian capital of Vienna. As a kid, Preminger wanted to be an actor and memorized and performed monologues in public spaces and even skipped school to do so. And even though he became a director, he would never really let go of being an actor as well. He frequently made appearances in his movies and other people's movies, even in smaller roles, including the Batman series, which we'll get to that, but that's fun. But anyway, famed theater and film director Max Reinhardt set up a theatrical company in Vienna where Preminger gained a position as an apprentice and soon developed a mentor-student relationship with Reinhardt. Eventually, he struck out on his own as a theatrical director, directing plays like Erdgeist, Die Büchse der Pandora, the Pandora's Box, Roar China, and Agitprop. An industrialist recruited him, so like a big money person, think the Elon Musk of 1931, recruited him to direct his first film called The Great Love from 1931, despite Preminger not being very interested in the medium, but being very interested in the money. In 1935, Joseph Schenck and Daryl F. Zanuck recruited him in a whirlwind meeting to work for Fox in Hollywood. In fact, he was working on a rehearsal and they just kind of stormed in and were like, hey, you want to come meet with us at this hotel? And that's what happened. And he signed the contract to go to Hollywood. He directed some B pictures at Fox, coming in under budget and well on time as he did throughout most of his career, but was effectively ghosted by the studio after a dispute over how a scene was shot on the film Kidnapped from 1938. And that would also be a recurring theme in Preminger's career, fighting with people. Went to New York and was met with success on Broadway with long-running productions like Outward Bound and My Dear Children. Preminger had a tendency to take small roles on occasion in his plays, living out the acting dream of his youth, although he was often asked to play a bald Nazi by others, such as in Bob Hope's comedy film They Got Me Covered. During Zanuck's tenure in the Signal Corps in World War II, the substitute head of Fox brought Preminger back to do some B-movie work, but during this time, the director made his breakout movie, Laura. He was originally only the producer on the film, but became the director after making some important changes, such as casting Clifton Webb as Waldo. The initial actor had been Laird Kreger, the killer from The Lodger. Preminger
The Lodger
was
from the 40s, not the Hitchcock one.
Yeah, not the Hitchcock one, which I don't think ever showed the actual killer. The actual killer is only implied. Preminger was now a major director and produced other big hits like Fallen Angel from 1945 and Daisy Kenyon from 1947. He established an eternal loyalty to Tallulah Bankhead after the actress asked her Speaker of the House father to intercede with immigration quotas. When immigration quotas stopped Preminger's family from fleeing the Nazis. So her father was able to get his family safely to America, and a forever friendship was born. During the 50s and 60s, Preminger spent a lot of his creative clout challenging censorship with movies like The Moon is Blue from 1953, Anatomy of a Murder from 1959, Advise and Consent from 1962, and challenging the blacklist of the McCarthy era by doing stuff like acknowledging Dalton Trumbo for his work on Exodus from 1960, Dalton Trumbo being one of the writers who was blacklisted from Hollywood during the McCarthy era. Returned to his recurring bit of a bald Nazi in Stalag 17 from 1953, which you can hear more about on Filmlings episode 135, where we talk about that movie as well as others by that director. Became known for both a very liberal worldview and an incredibly domineering directorial style, which is an interesting contrast, earning nicknames like Otto the Terrible and Otto the Ogre, although this is partially believed to have been somewhat of a calculation on his part, a not uncommon directorial tactic to deal with publicity, studios, and stars during the era,
but there were some very real stories of traumatized actors long after working with him.
Yeah, especially Gene Seberg on Bonjour Tristesse is probably the best example. He kind of tried to like Svengali her, and it didn't end great. But I think I have a plug for that later if you want to hear more about that. He played Mr. Freeze on Batman from 1960, so he did it. So it is really funny to me, and I wonder if this has something to do with Arnold Schwarzenegger's later casting, that the first person to play a live-action Mr. Freeze was an Austrian, and then they later hired another Austrian to do Mr. Freeze again. I wonder if that has something to do with the casting, but I love it regardless. He voiced the Elven King in the 1977 The Hobbit TV movie. I had to throw that in there because of... my co-host here is one of the biggest LFGR fans in the world. I had to. And then through the late 60s and 70s, the last part of his career, Preminger faced increasing financial difficulties and some unsuccessful films like In Harm's Way from 1964, Skidoo from 1968, and Rosebud from 1975. And he finally passed away in 1986. But we are going to be taking a look very specifically at his work today, because that's what we do here on the podcast. So, Jonathan, what Preminger movies are we talking about today?
Well, Alex, we are starting off with Laura from 1944, classic noir based on the 1943 novel by Vera Caspary, starring Gene Tierney, Dana Andrews, Clifton Webb, and Vincent Price, with a screenplay by Jay Dratler, Samuel Hoffenstein, and Betty Reinhardt, and with cinematography by Joseph Lachelle. And
then we'll be talking about Bonjour Tristesse, or however you say that in French, from 1958, which translates as Hello Sadness, based on the 1954 novel by Francis, I don't know. This film stars Gene Seberg, who we mentioned before, Deborah Kerr, and David Niven, with a screenplay by Arthur Lawrence and cinematography by Georges Perrinal.
Yeah, the combo of Gene Seberg, Deborah Kerr, and David Niven is fascinating because of the varying films that we've covered, all three of them in previously on this podcast.
They managed to get their way into a lot of movies, don't they?
Yeah, and they're all very different and very different from this movie, and we'll get into all that. But we'll be following that with Anatomy of a Murder from 1959, based on a 1958 novel of the same name, written by Michigan Supreme Court Justice John D. Volker, who based the novel in turn on a 1952 case in which he was the defense attorney. Starring Jimmy Stewart, Ben Gazzara, Lee Remick, Arthur O'Connell, Eve Arden, and George C. Scott. Screenplay by Wendell Mays, cinematography by Sam Leavitt. Man, I love George C. Scott in everything.
Yeah. And then we're going to be talking about Bunny Lake is Missing from 1965, which is based on the 1957 novel by Miriam Modell, starring Carol Lindley, Keir Dullea, and Laurence Olivier. Screenplay by John Mortimer and Penelope Mortimer, and cinematography by Dennis N. Coop.
All right, so with all of that, let's get into Laura from 1944. Jason, set it up for us.
Laura from 1944. New York detective Mark McPherson investigates the murder of a beautiful young advertising executive named Laura. She was a woman surrounded by characters like Waldo Lydecker, a columnist and overbearing mentor, and Shelby Carpenter, a parasitic playboy. But as McPherson finds himself so wrapped up in the case that he might be falling in love with the dead woman, one thing turns it all upside down. Laura isn't really dead.
All right, Jonathan. So I don't know about you, but this was one of the movies that we had to study in film school. This was one of the first ones we watched when it came to studying film noir, and it kind of makes sense as to why.
Oh no, it's a classic. I don't think that I was ever assigned this one, but I had seen it before. Maybe I can't remember if it was back when we covered noir and it was just an extra movie that I watched, or if I just picked it up because I knew it was a famous noir. But it's got all the things. It's got like when we did our noir episode, we had detectives, dames. You've got the moral ambiguity. You've got the suspicious characters and all that kind of stuff. The only thing it really doesn't have exactly is a femme fatale.
Yeah, not really. But that's kind of like the main conceit, like the unique conceit of this story is it's kind of a reverse psycho twist, if that makes sense. We think this main character is dead for half of the movie, and then she's not. Sorry if that's a spoiler. It's a really old movie. I don't think that counts anymore. But Laura. We think Laura's dead, and halfway through she's not dead, which is the main conceit of the movie. And
there are kind of some similarities with Rebecca, but also in reverse.
Yes,
a little bit.
Yeah, which is interesting considering some of the other stuff we're working on right now, that they essentially reversed the timeline of a murder case and undeaded somebody.
Yeah.
And then use that essentially as a way to shake out more info from the people to get their reactions. But that is kind of the basis of the plot structure, right? Is this detective is going around asking everybody questions, trying to get somewhere with this case. He's becoming obsessed with this woman whose death he's investigating. He's living in her apartment for a time, which I don't fully understand why that's a thing. It's like I think that's police procedure, but he's there.
Yeah, the kind of falling in love with the dead woman they almost ask the audience to take it for granted rather than really developing it, because by the time that and I'm going to forget all of their names here, but by the time that the old writer guy is like, you're in love with her, aren't you? I was like, is he? And then he started doing stuff that was like, oh yeah, he is. He's kind of obsessed with her.
Yeah. The passage of time is a little weird is a little wonky in this movie. Like if there's a slightly clearer way to denote how much time it passed, I think that would help a little, but it is effective for what is going on.
Yeah.
And we should mention before we get too far into themes and such, some of the technical conceits of the movie that are quite interesting and that kind of lean into the Preminger style as a whole. For starters, it's very theatrical. It's almost a bottle episode.
Oh, yeah.
In a way, right? It's got very few sets.
Yeah.
Very limited down. Basically, all of the sets could be a theatrical set too, with a few flats, a couple extra add-ons and stuff.
That's almost a noir thing too, because when I think about this movie, the aesthetic and the most important scenes, they feel aesthetically very similar to some of the other great noirs like Double Indemnity or Maltese Falcon. Yes. Like they all take place in these kind of generic but kind of ornate rooms that really doesn't matter, because what you're there to watch is the interaction of the characters and the interplay of the emotions and stuff like that, more than the set dressing, except for that one picture of Laura, which is very important.
Mm-hmm. And I will say there is a masterly use of shadows in this movie, and in all of the movies we'll talk about today, with the exception of Bonjour Tristesse, mostly parts of Bonjour Tristesse, yes, there is a very solid use of shadows, which is a good noir trope. Also a very good German Austrian trope as well, which fits for Preminger. Mm-hmm. But just the usage of that makes the cinematography in all of his films feel very deep, very textured, very rich. And then, of course, he has this habit of using these very long shots where the eye is almost kind of wandering around the scene. If you can think back to our neo-noir episode and how we talked about the camera movements on The Long Goodbye, for the one from the 1970s, kind of like that. But even more so for Laura, it's with a purpose, and it almost feels like the detective's eye is wandering around some of these locations, especially the opening shot where we're almost in close-up on different various parts of this room, just kind of wandering around, browsing the shelves and such while we hear the dialogue in the background. Then it's essentially an effect where the cut, there are camera cuts because we're basically moving from one camera setup to another, but the camera cut comes through the movement of the camera, where the cameras move so much that it technically qualifies as a new setup, but just through, or it would had you stop down and move the camera, to essentially create that effect of montage through the camera movement itself, which without the actual physical cutting of the film feels like more of a theatrical conceit than a cinematic one, but lends itself very well to the way that a theatrical-based director like Preminger tells his stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, what do you think about this concept of... We talked about a little bit about the detective falling in love with Laura, even though she's technically dead at the start of the movie.
She's technically not dead at the start of the movie.
Technically not dead. Perceived dead at the start of the movie.
Yeah.
What
about it?
It's interesting because there is something of falling in love with the unattainable that is part of movie culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Or the ideal of a woman. And this is something that we just talked about in a time warpy fashion on an episode we just recorded that isn't released yet, but regarding Vertigo, because that's what Vertigo is all about, which came out quite a while after this movie, but it still falls in that noir, because it's a very noir thing too. I mean, it is a very human thing, but it can provide a lot of very interesting dark drama in noir films when you have someone who's fallen in love with someone they either can't have or that they are perceiving in a way that the person is not, which is a very unhealthy thing. But it's interesting that in this movie, it's kind of rewarded. Like, it's kind of the good guys who are doing that, and it's not the same kind of creepy, obsessive desire like in Vertigo. Yeah. Well, except for in terms of the other character, because there's kind of a contrast between our detective character and the writer character. Yeah. It's just one is more healthy about it, I guess.
Well, I think it does make a lot of sense for the not that it's good, but it does make a lot of sense that the writer character essentially, he kind of is in the midst of Svengaling Laura in the movie before she, quote, dies, right? So as a writer, he's kind of writing her character to be his ideal woman, and then when she refuses to cooperate anymore, that's when he decides to kill her.
Yeah.
But I do find that there's something, especially in this older breed of movies from the studio system, when being a movie star was much more pronounced. You know, we have famous actors these days, but we don't have stars in the same way that we did. Right? Like these purely like studio crafted, unattainable figures. They didn't have an Instagram. We didn't know anything about their personal lives besides what the papers put out or the tabloids put out, which is normally boilerplate handed to them by the studio. So they became these mythical, unattainable figures who everyone loved, and they were perfect. And so there's something fundamental about the American cinema that is the love of that unattainable figure, of that star that's too high to reach. And then the interesting thing about Laura is that suddenly that star comes in reach, and what happens then?
Yeah.
And I will say there's a couple unique moments or interesting moments around that, but it doesn't really get explored here. Maybe most interesting thing to bring to spin off of this love of the unattainable is that it's a theme, much like you said, Jonathan, that plays very strongly into another director's work, Hitchcock. And I think we're going to see today that there is quite a bit of similarity between the work of Preminger and Hitchcock. The way they crafted their personalities, their love of expressionist German shadows, their kind of like twisted interests or complicated interests of their protagonists and stuff of that matter. And it's a little hard to tell who's following who, but I will say that Laura, coming out in 1944, already follows quite a few very successful noirs by Hitchcock. Although I haven't found much connecting the two quite directly.
Yeah, there's just, it's kind of a common threads that run through a lot of these films that are in the same time period, about the same kind of subject, and it's just a matter of kind of the ones that ended up rising to the top, which we've covered several of on the podcast. I think there's another interesting character, though, in that mix of the desire and the attainability, and that is the gosh, I can't remember his name, but the other guy that she's on and off about marrying, the country guy,
the
old
rich,
money,
yeah. Like, well, he's not rich anymore, I guess, is the thing.
Yeah, but he's and there's also like a lot of this implied, oh gosh, I don't even know how to put it, because there's this implied relationship between Laura and the writer. And then there's also the less implied relationship between that guy and the old lady with money who just is pawing at him the whole time. And he kind of wants Laura, but he wants her in a different way than the other men do, because I don't know, it's less that he wants to be with her and more that he just wants to be with the idea of her and someone who's not an old lady with money, basically.
Well, I would say that all of them, that's true, but I would also say that all of them kind of want to be with an idea of Laura, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is we're building this tapestry of around the same theme. It's all these men who are idealizing a version of Laura that none of them in their solarity fully exist, but it's kind of a combination of all the things that the three different men want about her. Yeah,
they're all partially true to an extent and partially false.
Right.
But even as the audience, we're never really given a full idea of who Laura actually is as a character. She gets relatively little screen time as a character throughout the movie. Surprising, right, considering the movie's called Laura.
Well, she gets more screen time than Rebecca.
This is true. But yeah, she.
Speaking of Rebecca, it's interesting that Judith Anderson is in this movie. She was the housekeeper in Rebecca, and she's in this one too. But it's so funny, after watching Rebecca, you almost can't see her as anything but the domineering. I think she was the older woman who wanted to be with the country guy.
Well, that's the risk of being a villain in a Hitchcock movie. You might be typecast forever.
Forever.
Or an Anthony Perkins, man.
Yeah, not Jimmy Stewart though, so good on him.
Nah, leading characters can normally avoid that. But alas, anything else to say about Laura before we move on to Bonjour Tristesse?
I don't think so, except that just to roll into Bonjour Tristesse is that those implied relationships that are in the background and the kind of, for lack of a better word, looseness of morality that is implied in the story, but it's not the forefront, kind of sets the stage for some of the stuff we're going to talk about with the way that Preminger brings controversial topics to the screen. And those controversial topics, particularly the looseness of relationships, become the focal point of Bonjour Tristesse in a really interesting way that there's going to be lots to talk about. So let's set it up for us, Jason.
Bonjour Tristesse from 1958. Told through reminiscence, Cécile recounts the story of the summer she was 17 on the French Riviera. Her and her father, Raymond, live a carefree and consequence-free lifestyle. But when her godmother and Raymond's love interest, Anne, arrives for vacation, Cécile finds her lifestyle and worldview threatened.
All right, Jonathan, I'm going to be right up front. This is maybe my least favorite movie out of the collection we have today.
I agree, but there is some really interesting stuff to talk about.
Yeah, that's kind of the whole thing, and it kind of shows in relief what Preminger's good at and what he's not. The thing I'll call attention to first is the way the space is captured on film, and the fact that this is, I think, the only movie with any color footage in it. Although it's not entirely color that we're talking about today. And the most interesting thing about that is how it almost feels like Preminger founders when he's outside. I don't know how fair that is.
You mean like physical location outside?
Yeah, like physically he's shooting this on the French Riviera.
Yeah.
One of the most beautiful locations in the world. And it just doesn't feel as beautiful as you'd expect, which you could kind of chalk up to kind of a theme of the story maybe, but it feels like a missed opportunity, and something that almost makes the movie feel a little flatter is that the exteriors feel so flat. Like it feels like he struggles to capture the sea in a very interesting or appealing kind of way.
I wonder if there was some external influence on that, because I had a similar thought, but less so about the cinematography necessarily, but it felt like everything was redubbed. Like it almost felt like I was watching a foreign film that was poorly like reformatted for America. So I don't know if maybe they had local crews who were not as experienced as he was used to working with in Hollywood. There was something technically lacking, though. I agree. In the way that a lot of that stuff was shot. Like just the sound didn't sound right, and the effect of the ADR was maybe the worst ADR for a movie that was made in English that I've ever seen, because the deliveries just felt rushed and
it's kind of off-putting, right?
Awkward. You kind of I don't know if it got better or if you just get used to it by the end of the movie, but it takes a long time to really like look past that and just watch the dang movie.
Yeah. That and then of course speaking of audio dialogue, the narration.
Oh, I forgot.
Ooh, boy.
That's a big thing.
I did not like the narration. I did not like it. And it wasn't necessarily just about the delivery. It was more like it was kind of unnecessary to a certain extent, you know, like there was a lot of...
Here's my take. And I think this is 58, so I can't tell how much water this take is going to hold. But no French Riviera pun intended. The whole vibe of this film felt like a wannabe French New Wave film, and Jean Seberg doesn't help because she's like the poster girl for French New Wave. But yeah, it's like it wanted to be a true faux film. It wanted to be something kind of sleek and witty, and it gets at some really interesting ideas. It just is kind of awkward at points in its execution.
Yes. Yeah. Like the story itself isn't necessarily like a bad one, and the themes aren't bad, and the things it explores, it feels like it's worth exploring. But the way the narration is presented, which we were just talking about this while we were time traveling the other day, but there's like this French New Wave conceit where people narrate over a movie, and it's like rambling about philosophy and feelings for like the entirety of the movie, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And this is one of the times where it doesn't, and it feels like it's because it's trying to imitate that. Yeah. And it just comes off as really whiny in places, which is kind of appropriate because this is You're Not My Real Mom, the movie.
Yeah.
But it's also, and in other places, it feels like, oh God, I can't even remember the exact sequence, but it was like describing stuff that was actively happening on the screen.
Oh, like
And
when
the
she's going
narration-
out with guys and like, I don't
Yeah.
really care about this guy. I'll dump him in the morning, blah, blah, blah. He thinks that we're
Yeah.
going to be a
It was
thing,
just-
but we're not.
Like a bunch of wasted time that could have been better served if you wanted to communicate, if you really needed to communicate that dialogue or feeling, could have been better communicated through either camera grammar
Yeah.
and looking and reacting shots, or through having a side character or confidant of some kind that she could confide in the movie across. And this is, to be fair, this is a kind of a hard film to tackle because none of these characters are great.
Right. I mean, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here's what I want. I want to go through the themes of this movie as represented by the other films that we've seen these actors in. Okay. So
Go for it.
the film is about this kind of free love kind of thing. Like the dad is always philandering. He can't ever settle down. When he finally does with the Deborah Kerr character, she has kind of grounded him, but she has her own flaws. She has a little bit of hypocrisy in her own advice to Gene Seberg's character and then in her own actions. But she recognizes that and she's like trying to be better. And Gene Seberg is just bitter about it and doesn't realize until too late that they actually needed that kind of grounding force in their lives. And it's so interesting because we've seen Gene Seberg in Breathless, where it was kind of the same thing where she was going off with this guy. Nothing really mattered. They ended up getting in trouble. Guy dies. And she kind of has this really cold expression that the film ends on. And then Deborah Kerr, who we've seen in, Black Narcissus. And she's the nun that is trying to be super controlling and like basically the repressive force on all of these nuns when a man comes into their midst. And so she's kind of that here, but she's also kind of loosened up in the way that she, wants to get married to him. She feels the attraction to David Niven's character. And David Niven, who's just like a comedian. We've seen him in the Pink Panther and he's been in so much stuff, but a lot of comedy stuff. And he really is kind of the comic relief in what is essentially a Greek tragedy in this movie.
Yeah.
And so just the mix of those, like these actors who are from these films and they're kind of iconic in these different types of films coming together into this one, which is about things that these actors are usually in films that are adjacent to, is a really interesting mix, but it takes all of them and mashes them together and doesn't do it super elegantly because, and I say that mostly because the film that this reminded me the most of, which is really kind of an interesting contrast just in the titles, is Le Bonheur from Agnes Varda, which was all about this man who goes and philanders around on his wife and then tells her, like, this is such a great thing. I'm so happy. You should be happy that I'm happy. And then she kills herself. And it's almost
She was not
this
in fact
film,
happy that he was happy.
but it's almost this film matured and turned into something much more sensitive and kind of thoughtful and introspective. Like it felt a lot like this movie, just the way it should have been. And it's
Isn't
also
that
kind of reversed.
Doesn't Le Bonheur mean like the happiness?
Yeah, it means
too?
the
And-
happiness, which is,
And this movie means goodbye sadness. So
it
that's
means
kinda
hello
funny.
sadness. Yeah.
Yeah, or hello sadness. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. That makes a lot of sense. I did hear that apparently David Niven would have these knockdown, drag out arguments with Preminger on set. He did not
gosh.
have the best relationship with the actors on this film. And that Niven would just like drive off for like the day and then shooting would stop down until they agreed to work together again.
Niven seems like he would be a really great guy to get along with. So if you're not,
that's the thing too, is that everyone was shocked. Like Deborah Kerr was shocked because David Niven is not that kind of guy to get into an argument with people. Or
not to mention he has a military history. I wouldn't even try that.
Preminger is just intense. He's an intense and problematic dude when it comes to, like, I would never want to have Preminger as a boss.
Yeah.
The
other thing Niven was in was A Matter of Life and Death. He's the main guy.
Oh yeah.
There's a lot of Archer crossover with this movie.
He's in a lot of Archer movies. Yeah. Niven just kind of like is one of those guys who we've never done a focused study of, but he's one of those, like, I guess, character actors who just kind of like, he's in everything from this period.
Yeah.
He's that guy. He's that guy who's in everything. He's like he's almost the Gary Oldman of the classic era. It's like, yeah, you've seen him. He's in everything. He's probably good in it too. You just don't remember him. But yeah. And then, of course, we do have to talk about the weird relationship between Gene Seberg and Preminger, which we're not going to go into too much, like, timeline and detail here, but it wasn't good. It was an intensely controlling director and actress relationship, almost Svengali-like, where Preminger very much controlled her. People said at the time it was kind of an imitation, but to a less extreme degree, of the control exerted by the director of the silent movie version of Joan of Arc, which is a really good movie. But then you find out that the director of that movie kind of like locked the actress up for an extended period of time to get her to a...
Was that Carl Dreyer?
That version? I don't remember. But he like locked the actress up or something for an extended period of time to get her into like this crazed emotional state to basically cry really effectively on camera. But it was like that to a less extreme degree, where Preminger kind of controlled what Gene Seberg did, where she went, who she did stuff with.
There's an anecdote about a film that we're not covering, but one of the actors, one of the male actors, Preminger screamed at so much that he literally had convulsions and like anxiety attacks on set. And then Preminger would film his hands shaking. And the actor's brother said years later that he can't watch that movie because he knows what his brother went through, and that like that's not acting, that's just trauma.
That's just abuse. Yeah. Yeah. Preminger's one of those characters who there's a reason that he wasn't as popular as Hitchcock.
Yeah.
even though
Hitchcock had his quirks, but
he would play pranks on people, but he was never as bad as Preminger. Preminger is rough. But yeah, the partnership relationship, I don't know, weird controlling thing between Seberg and Preminger lasted from the film St. Joan to the film Bonjour Tristesse. And if you're interested in hearing more about that, then I recommend a series on one of my favorite podcasts that is in this podcast called You Must Remember This. And it's the series Gene and Jane that traces the crisscrossing paths of Gene Seberg and Jane Fonda during the mid-20th century, kind of in this new wave era. And it includes quite a bit of detail on the relationship between Gene Seberg and Otto Preminger.
I was interested to find out when looking up stuff for this episode that Gene Seberg wasn't French; she was American, because she shows up in so much French stuff.
Yeah, she was American. She just did a lot of work in France. Yeah, that, and she had a short haircut. That was kind of like the
well,
the big thing. And
I think
never
she's
really
the one that made that a French thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
basically because she had short hair in Breathless. Yeah, it kind of became a thing. And pretty sure, I don't remember entirely, but I'm pretty sure she died really young.
Yeah,
so she didn't get...
She kind of had a lot of bad luck, not just with Preminger, but with other controlling directors, and also had, like, kind of went through anxiety and stuff, and kind of similar to a Marilyn Monroe kind of a story, which is really sad. I think there was actually a biopic about it with Kristen Stewart or someone.
Oh, yeah.
Recent.
Yeah. Yeah, she passed away of suicide at age 40. So we never really got a chance to see her. And between that and the controlling partnership she was in, we never really got a chance to see her truly blossom as an actress, which is a huge bummer. Because she definitely had the makings of someone who could be a really, really, really huge talent on screen. So that is sad. And definitely one part of her tragedy is Preminger. So
right.
And I do think we would be remiss to not mention that.
I want to say Preminger actually gave Seberg her start, I believe, with this film and the one that they did right before this.
St. Joan?
St. Joan, yeah. So that those two films kind of started off her career, but again, kind of set her on a not great trajectory, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yep. But that is Bonjour Tristesse, which itself is not on a great trajectory.
One last thing, though, that I thought was a really fun, subtle slip in there that, again, just makes this movie feel like there was a lot of stuff they could have done with it that they didn't. And that's at one point, Seberg's character, I think when Deborah Kerr comes to the resort, she's talking about the housekeepers. And she says, there are these weird sisters that, are always switching off. Because remember, they keep switching the names of which one is which. But there are three. There are three sisters. And she calls them the Weird Sisters, which is a Macbeth reference to the witches and the fates. Which, again, kind of just gives this Greek tragedy air to the whole movie. But it's also super subtle. Although that
makes sense.
The one scene right before they do the scene where they go to the casino and David Niven decides he's going to go off with Deborah Kerr, they're going to get married, they're going to get settled, and then the other chick runs off with the Cuban because she's so upset. Right before they go to the casino, they're all toasting, and the one maid is just like chugging alcohol. She's just going for it, which is kind of ominous if you picked up on the little fate thing earlier. Mm-hmm. So that's all. That's the last thing.
I mean, that makes sense, especially considering Preminger is such like a theatrical character.
And he is very well read. Like, a lot of his movies are not originals, but they're very literary based. Like, they're based on books or they're based on pre-existing material. But he had a wide breadth of understanding of those types of. Again, it reminds me of the. I think it was a Billy Wilder quote that to be a good director, you don't necessarily have to be a good writer, but you've got to be a good reader. You've got to be able to read a story for the things that are in it that make it appealing and interesting.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, we've seen that time and again on the show. Yeah. He was. That's the sad thing about Preminger is that it's kind of tragic just to look at his career because it's like you were good. Like you had this talent as like this director and this actor as an actor too, and you're well read and you're intelligent. You're just also an abusive asshole. And if you could have just not been that last thing, your career would have been even better.
Yeah.
That would have been great. And also all the people who you were an abusive asshole to wouldn't have had to have suffered because you were an abusive asshole.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just used up our entire curse word quota for the podcast. So let's move on to Anatomy of a Murder from 1959. Jason, take it away.
Anatomy of a Murder from 1959. On the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, an Army lieutenant kills a man who's just raped his wife. Former District Attorney Paul Biegler is convinced to take the case by his alcoholic mentor. Now it's up to Biegler to climb back in the saddle and prove that his client was temporarily insane at the time of the shooting.
All right, Jonathan, I will say that before we get too far into this, and a quick plug too, that I have been playing a lot of Ace Attorney lately, a visual novel game about court cases, which is not very legally accurate, but is very fun to have been playing at the same time that we did some research and watching of Anatomy of a Murder, because the way this case takes place is both very similar to and very different from Ace Attorney. And I will say the most important similarity is the impact that the charisma of the lawyer has on the proceedings of the courtroom. And
that's interesting, because that's kind of like the defining trait of courtroom drama, because there's not much else that's interesting about being in an actual courtroom.
Well, that's kind of the point, right? And that's something my chat on my Twitch channel, Packwalk on Twitch, go give it a follow, talks about all the time, is how the legalese in most law stories, law fiction, is just made up for the sake of the plot.
Right.
But I feel like the legalese in this movie, it has to be fairly accurate, right? Because like we mentioned in the intro to today's podcast, this is a story written by a judge,
right?
About a court case he actually had, and the objections, and I don't know, it feels more accurate than it otherwise would have been. But I'm not a law expert. I can't vouch for that. But even though it's we're going to suppose fairly accurate, there's a surprising amount of drama in this court case.
Oh yeah, yeah, and it's really what the film is about. And again, this film is a noir, but it's one of those noirs almost like Ace in the Hole that deviates a little bit from some of the stock tropes of noir. But the thing that holds it together in that genre is that every character is gray. Every character, and Jimmy Stewart actually says
literally,
that
it's shot in black and white.
Yeah, it's shot in black and white. But Jimmy Stewart says that is, you quickly as a lawyer begin to realize that people are not just good or just bad, but they're a mix of a lot of different things. And that's what every character, even Jimmy Stewart, who you want to like because he's just Jimmy Stewart, is still doing things like witness coaching. And, he's building a case, trying to do it the right way, but this is not a morality play. This is him trying to win a case for people who he doesn't even really like, which is kind of the note that the film ends on. And using the means that he
they
can.
Skip out on the bill.
Do what?
They stick him with the tab.
Yeah,
they just bounce before they even pay him.
And they're terrible people. But he's taken the case and he's got to win it, and it becomes almost a game for him. To win and to show how good he is. And it's less about getting to the right verdict and more about just getting the one that he was hired for, which I guess is like a lot of what law is, but it's still like, it kind of just shows the seedy underbelly of all kinds of court proceedings. Although obviously the vast majority of cases are not as dramatic and narrative as this one. A lot of them are much more clear cut, I hope.
Yeah, as somebody told me the other day, there are no Moriartys.
Yeah.
No one really pulls off super spectacular, super complicated crimes. That's like,
there was a Hitler though, so
incredibly rare. There was a Hitler, yes. This is true. But yeah, this is a very gray case. This is a very weird case. I will say it's a good case for bringing you into this gray morality, especially because like the fundamental question of the case about this guy who killed another guy who almost certainly
allegedly
raped his wife.
Yeah,
like allegedly, sure, but almost certainly raped his wife. It puts you in a position where you're like, well, we can't know for sure, but we seem pretty certain that it is. And if that is the case, I don't think a lot of people actually feel that bad about that guy dying. Yeah. So, it puts the audience in that good position to experience that gray morality where you can feel like curious about it, but you don't feel that guilty about feeling that way either. And
the
also,
audience
of course,
becomes the jury, and that's part of the marketing that Preminger did for this is, he would build it up as you are going to be the jury of this film. You are going to decide, and you kind of get to that point. The jury does eventually make a decision, but you are the whole time kind of going back and forth, and you're playing along with the things where Jimmy Stewart will throw something out there and it will get dismissed by the court. And then I love the line where, where the guy turns to Jimmy Stewart and says, "How can they forget something that they've already heard?" And Jimmy Stewart says, "They can't." And that basically becomes his strategy for the rest of the case, is to just throw stuff out there to influence the emotions and the subconscious of the jury, which is also what is happening to the audience. And it's really what filmmaking is about, especially in, again, going back to a Hitchcockian type of filmmaking, which, as Alex and I were talking about off air, is it feels like, and not to disparage Preminger's own merits, but it feels like a lot of Preminger is coming in following the heels of Hitchcock and the things that Hitchcock would do. And Hitchcock was a master of leading the audience emotions. He knew, 3 scenes earlier what the audience needed to be feeling in order to get ready for his big reveals and stuff like that. And so that's kind of the way that the film strings us along and manipulates how we feel about each of the different characters, whether they're quote unquote good guys or quote unquote bad guys, because none of them are really either of those things. And that's the same thing that's happening in the courtroom that's happening with the audience.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you mentioned us being, as the audience, being the jury, Jonathan, because I just realized that almost the entire court case is shot from the jury box. We see the jury maybe twice, when they're introduced and when they give the verdict. Yeah. But almost, and a couple times when we flip across the 180-degree line, but essentially that line is drawn right in front of the jury box, and we spend the entire time on that side of the line, like we're the jury watching the proceedings. And like we mentioned before in Laura, where there's the long camera takes of the eye wandering around, that happens again in this movie, but again from the jury's perspective. So in Laura, where that camera eye wandering around was the detectives, now it's us as the jury watching this case unfold. And when we cut away from that long shot, that wide shot, that's the jury's perspective, we're going into a medium or close-up that is something that the jury wouldn't hear or wouldn't see. Right. So normally a conference between the lawyers and the judge, or a conference between the lawyer and his client, or the lawyer and somebody in the peanut gallery right behind him. Something that would be out of earshot for the jury. But if it's in the jury's frame of reference, we're in that wide shot. Yeah. Yeah. Or we're, kind of zoomed in on something that they would be focused on. But there are so many shots where you see the witness and the lawyer right up in their face, but we are profiled to them, like, again, like you're saying, right in that position. And some of those scenes are the most intense scenes, because what the film ultimately turns into is this chess match battle of wits between the 2 lawyers, kind of the 3 lawyers, where, you're going back and forth with the witness, but it's point, counterpoint. It's, checkmate, back and forth. And of course, the final moment of the case is great, because the final point that's made in the defense's favor is made by the prosecution. The defense almost stumbles into tricking the prosecution into winning the case. Well, what happens is that they break, George C. Scott's character breaks the first rule of law, which I don't know if it's a real rule of law, but it's basically all I know about law, which is never ask a question you don't already know the answer to. And he assumed he knew her relationship to the guy who got shot. I'm forgetting all their names. But he didn't actually know. He thought that the waitress was the dead guy's lover, but it turned out that she was his daughter. Right. And that becomes the linchpin in the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Especially because she was essentially like providing the key piece of evidence to prove that the rape did happen. Yeah, but she didn't know it until the very end. Yeah. 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 Although, speaking of that, we should say that in 1959, this is part of that streak of Premingers that we spoke about.
This is a
that
big
is
one.
him. Well, we've talked about how he's willing to fight everybody for
Right.
sometimes no good reason. But he's also willing to fight the censors. And in this case, he's willing to fight them on like this relatively frank discussion of sexual assault and rape in a like largely released movie in the United States, which had not happened before.
Yeah.
And this is a big thing that pushes that boundary. And in a lot of ways, the work that he does with stuff like that helps pave the way for the American New Wave that's just around the corner from a movie like this.
I was thinking that too. Like a lot of Preminger is almost the bridge between classic golden age Hitchcock style filmmaking and American New Wave edgy code, because these films are coming out right at the end of the Hays Code. I think one of his films is actually credited with being like one of the final films made under the Hays Code. But this is definitely up there in those taboo challenging films. And it's interesting because the censorship board had a list of things that they didn't want him to say in the discussions of the rape, like because I mean they get into a lot of they kind of do it from a more obviously objective and sort of scientific point of view, but they wanted them to remove a bunch of very specific words, and he only gave in on one. He only made one concession and was still able to release the film with the MPA approval. And because he had released films before without the MPA approval as almost like his own rebellion, and probably worked to attract more people to the movie that way. But this one, he actually got the approval without making any of those concessions except one. Mm-hmm.
Which is pretty key to breaking down that code even more by doing it with approval. So no, this is a fascinating one, and also there's some other fun stuff in there. The fact that it has such a gigantic runtime but passes by relatively fast is shocking and impressive. The intro titles are done by, I think, that one guy that you really like, Jonathan, but whose name is slipping my mind, who does the really
Saul
cool
Bass.
graphic
Yes,
novels. Saul Bass,
he did a lot of Preminger's title work.
Yeah, this one, and then I think, I don't know if he does Bunny Lake is Missing, but the style is very similar for Bunny Lake is Missing.
Right, yeah.
That cut out, almost stop motion-y graphics, which are there. And then between the graphics and kind of like the sly, almost suggestive, like look of collaboration on Jimmy Stewart's face, there's kind of like a wink and a nod aspect to this whole movie. And just very technically, by the way it ends, you could classify this as a comedy in like the Greek sense, even though a guy died. But yeah, there's this other note in the tone where it almost feels like you're getting away with something the entire course of the movie.
Yeah, and you do have this interesting, I don't know, I still think it would probably be classified as a tragedy just because of the way that, well, I guess it depends who we're really following. If we're following Jimmy Stewart versus the defendant and his wife, because they definitely end on a tragedy. Jimmy Stewart is kind of has that noir detective nonchalance about how the whole thing plays out. It was more about the case for him than about the people, which is really interesting.
All right, Jonathan, anything else to say about Anatomy of a Murder, or is it time to move on to Bunny Lake is Missing?
Yeah, let's get into our final film. Jason, take it away.
Bunny Lake is Missing from 1965. Anne Lake and her daughter Bunny moved to London along with Anne's brother Stephen. Anne enrolls her daughter in a preschool, but at the end of her first day, the little girl is nowhere to be found. Police Superintendent Newhouse begins investigation immediately. But with the family's history and their recent arrival in the country, doubt builds as to whether Bunny ever existed at all.
All right, Jonathan, before we talk about how this is kind of a Psycho movie, I do need to say that the cinematography in this movie is
so good,
astounding. The technical feats between the light and the sound in this movie are phenomenal.
Yeah.
It's all black and white, but it's in like CinemaScope now. I don't know if that's the specific name used for it.
No,
but
it's in
widescreen.
very widescreen though.
Yeah. But the texture is so rich, and it feels like you could reach out and touch everything on screen and you would know exactly how it feels. It is gorgeously shot, especially considering how shadowy everything is.
Yeah.
In fact, the shadows basically help accentuate that texture.
Which also gives it more close relationship to a Psycho type movie.
Yes, yeah. And then of course the sound design is phenomenal too. You're moving through all of these like older British buildings with creaky wooden floors and through these streets and through these creepy basements and stuff. And you can hear where you go, everywhere you go, the footsteps change, the interactions with people change. And unlike the ADR in Bonjour Tristesse, the dialogue here sounds really good.
Yeah.
And there's even like a really interesting use of some pop music in the score, used diegetically in
that was
bar in one other location.
Almost shoot in, but it still kind of worked.
It's a little shoot in, but it's like earned by everything else, all the other really solid technical work on the movie.
Yeah.
This is clearly the work of some really skilled craftsmen working with a director who's worked on movies for 20 some odd years at this point. It's very clear all of that, how all of that is here.
You know what the sad thing about it is? With all that being said, is this would be a really, really, really good movie if Psycho didn't exist. I think that's where we're going to end up.
That might be where we end up. But I will say, we kind of have like this, like the locations kind of matter in this movie and especially as they're related to each other, because there is kind of like this note of detection as we try to suss out where this little girl disappeared to, or if she even existed. And the relation between different locations, different addresses matters. And there's always this maintained sense of space about where you are in a building, how far you are from another location. Because there's always like a second entrance to a location. There's always another room, a hidden attic apartment above the school, which is weird, but whatever. A little extra. And that hidden extra space, that hidden extra entrance and exit is an important part of the theming, because that comes into a main part of the plot, right? There's these secret counter plot that's been working its way through the movie. They don't realize is happening until partway through. And the idea of a hidden space is really important when you actually get towards the final reveals of the movie itself. But now that we've kind of talked about some of the technical stuff, let's talk about the plot and how Psycho-like it is, Jonathan.
Okay. I guess let's talk about just in general the merits of the plot on its own first, especially like through the beginning. You get a lot of really good mystery. You get a lot of good suspect building. You're trying to figure out the relationship between the brother and sister. You're really trying to figure out how far into the Greek tragedy hole we're going to end up.
I do think it's important at first that you don't know that they're brother and sister.
Right.
And that is in no way denoted until somebody asks.
Because they specifically assume they're a couple. Yeah. Which the audience is doing because the thing is, even after that, you're still trying to figure out if this is going to be a weird incest thing or not, for like a while, because the relationship is so weird. But that ends up at the Psycho point where we're getting to. But it also has, and I mentioned this off air too, it has a sense of the collector that we talked about at the end of last season by William Wyler, which was, as we described in that movie, is William Wyler Psycho, about this guy who's just completely obsessed with this woman and kidnaps her and brings her to his house, but has no concept of what he's done is wrong, no concept that there's any other way to go about getting someone to like him. And that's kind of where we end up with the brother and sister here, where there's just this delusion that is slowly sussed out for the audience across the course of the film. But even by the end, it doesn't end very satisfactorily, because at some point, I guess we'll just go there, because this is going to take up probably a good portion of the conversation. So spoilers for Bunny Lake is Missing. It's a fun ride, so pause now if you want to go watch it. But ultimately, we get to this point where the brother is in this, he either has some sort of split personality, or he just reverts to a childlike state periodically, but he has this attachment to his sister because his parents died or were absent, and they have this, his sister had this imaginary friend, and so that propagates this whole "does Bunny Lake exist" storyline for a very long time. But ultimately, it's just she does have a daughter, and the brother is trying to get rid of the daughter in order that there's nothing between them. But she can kind of control him by pretending that she's a child and she wants him to play with her. But it doesn't ever explain why she didn't tell this to the police in the first place.
Yeah, I guess the implication is that she didn't know that he. Well, she knew. She knew
exactly what to do when he had her at the end.
But I'm guessing that comes from her. I think the way I read it was that she understood immediately when she saw this other side of her brother, that because she would have been familiar with him as how he was as a child, that she needed to match and revert to how she was as a child to keep him from.
So you think this is the first time it's surfaced?
I think this is the first time it's surfaced. Yeah, that she's seen.
Okay.
I think she would have known that he was attached to her, but not to that kind of creepy degree.
Yeah.
Right? Because if she had known that he experienced that level of psychosis, there is no way she would have let him near her daughter.
Yeah.
Like, as blind as people can sometimes be in a movie, that wouldn't make any sense. She probably just thought he was an attached family member, and that because their parents were dead, they were all they had, so they had to stick together. And now it turns out that he's crazy, so she has to match that crazy. I actually find the ending up until the point the police arrive to be incredibly interesting, and like this weirdly tense scene of playing along and then watching to see, again, going back to this sense of space and distance between places and objects, how close she is to her daughter versus how close...
except for when he teleports into the greenhouse.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was the one where they kind of fudged it a bit, I think. I guess he could have slipped in behind her, but...
But once the police show up, it's kind of at that point it's a little bit of a thud, but
well, that's the last 2 minutes of the movie, so
that is the last 2 minutes of the movie. I was expecting something a little more dramatic for such a tense scene.
Yeah. I mean, Psycho has the whole summary by Edward. Was that Edward G. Robinson or the police guy who
I think it's Edward G. Robinson at the end, but it's like Edward G. Robinson adjacent, I think. But yeah, it's somebody who
he sits down and lays it all out for us,
gives the whole thing, and then we get the slow zoom into Anthony Perkins' face, which is really fascinating. But I don't know, something more tense, something where like maybe the police have to join in the game and join in the tension before they can finally corner him, or something like that.
So here's something interesting that I just found on the greatest of all research sites, Wikipedia, which is that Preminger thought that the ending would be too unrealistic. I don't know the actual ending of the book, but apparently he changed the murderer at the very last minute, and then had his writers kind of work overtime to kind of make the ending work. So I don't know
So
how
in the book,
that
did
exactly
he kill
would
the
work.
girl?
Okay, it says the identity of the would-be murderer. So the kidnapper, but I don't know who it would have been. Like, I don't know. I don't know what the book is, but it's interesting that he went and changed it to make this ending the way that it is.
Interesting. Well, I guess we got to look it up now.
Also,
Based
fun fact, the house Frogmore End, which is the one that that they end at, that was the brothers' boss's house, is the actual house of Daphne du Maurier's father, who wrote Daphne du Maurier wrote Rebecca. So it all kind of comes together here.
Oh yeah, Du Maurier is great. She writes
wrote
a
a
lot
ton,
of really
yeah.
great books that were made into a lot of really great movies.
I think she wrote The Birds as a short story. I forgot that.
I think she did actually. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of the great parts of this movie come from this sense of the real psychological thriller, which is not the brother's actual psychosis, but it's this woman who's not being believed, and she is trying to find any scrap of evidence that she can. And she's being chased. She has to escape from a hospital. She has to go into the creepiest doll store in the history of humanity.
Oh man, terrifying basement. I will say,
If the music
terrifying
was
doll
anything
basement does-
else, it would have been so much worse, because the music was not like a creepy children's lullaby. It was actually kind of a calming music, but that scene could have been so much scarier. But it didn't need to be, so it works as is, but those dolls just do it.
I'll tell you what, that basement does one up the basement in Psycho. The Psycho
That's true.
basement's creepy, but it is at the very least not stuffed with dilapidated children's dolls.
Just old people. Anyway,
That's
not this movie. It is kind of this movie, though. That's where we're getting at.
That's the point. That's the point.
Psycho does the same kind of thing better, which is sad because this is a good movie, but having seen Psycho, it loses some of its edge, I think.
Yeah. It's in that same like psychological thriller, psychological horror genre, like early 60s genre, but it's really, really good, but it's not like the epic tier that Psycho is. Like,
yeah, because all the elements of Psycho fall into place just right, and this one just has a few things that get awkward. The ending of this one is good, but it also kind of goes on for a few minutes longer than maybe it could. It
could shorten up a bit.
Although I really like the
good.
witch lady in the in the attic room, because she again gives that kind of Macbethian feel where she has this sort of sense about people and children, and she's kind of creepy, but you also feel like she knows what's going on. She's real creepy.
She records children's nightmares on phonograph records. She's super
I want a whole
creepy.
movie about her, honestly.
Who would let a woman like that just keep living above a school? Like,
she talks about them like flies to a spider. She said, "They don't let children come up here, but every now and then one slips past the defenses." And you're like, oh my gosh, do you eat them?
Yes, please enroll your child in our school. We have a creepy woman who will record your child's nightmares on a record.
Not to mention that school does have some really lax regulations.
They really do.
My wife is a teacher, and the whole time she was like, nope, they should have a list. They should have a record. Everyone should know who was with who. Like there should be a paper trail. There's no paper trail.
Yeah, right? Yeah. It's a mess. It's a big old mess.
But I guess we should talk about Laurence Olivier, because we just got off of talking about him a few episodes ago.
He makes an appearance again here as the cop. And I will say one of his more gentle appearances.
Yeah.
and certainly like a good authoritative figure who isn't too quick to jump the gun to any conclusions, and his uncertainty and doubt about everyone involved in this case shows.
Yeah. But he's also not going to take anyone at their word either.
Exactly. Yeah. He doesn't really believe anybody. And even when people start to think they have the case figured out, it's like, oh, well, she just made up this kid who's never existed. Even then, he doesn't quite believe that. And that kind of keeps
and he's
the
still
plot
going to be sensitive
moving.
with her.
Yeah. Yeah, because there's still a lifeline for her. And that does end up being the thing that saves them in the end, is that he did believe them and or give them a shot to be believed, and showed up at the end to arrest the evil brother.
What did you think about the inclusion of Noel Coward, who, speaking of Laurence Olivier, Noel Coward was a very famous playwright and actor in his own right, who did a lot of work kind of bringing, as Laurence Olivier was coming up and that kind of thing, and he makes an appearance in here, but it's almost extraneous.
It definitely is a little extraneous. He was, Coward was kind of like a mentor figure to Olivier, so it is kind of nice to see them reunited in that sense, but it didn't feel, I don't know, entirely necessary, I guess.
Yeah, the main thing I felt was that it was just adding to the roster of suspects because he's so creepy and out there, and like one of the other cops says, is basically just a pervert that is a red herring to make you think that someone stole the child to do terrible things to her. And
probably could have been cut for time.
Yeah, it could have been cut for time. It was
I
really just like
all the time on the show, but probably could have been cut for time.
It really felt like a name drop. Like the inclusion of the zombies, yes, their song was appropriate, but we just have a full-on close-up of the TV set showing the zombies play their music, and then we have Noel Coward monologuing creepily for a while. So some of those things like felt like they weren't. They kind of work, but they definitely felt like afterthoughts more than integral parts of the story.
I think they would have worked better trimmed down a little.
Yeah, or more just subtly used. Part
of this world that is being really cruel to this woman, but scaled down so it's not as specific.
Yeah.
Not as, it doesn't need to be, neither needed to be as highlighted as it was.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, y'all, let's, are you ready to slide into the overall notes?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, we definitely have to talk about, and we had mentioned throughout that Otto Preminger is a theater man first, and that shows, which is appropriate because another theater man first appears in one of the movies, Laurence Olivier. Mm-hmm. But he definitely seemed to fare better in smaller spaces. The more the scene looked like it could have been a theater set, the better the scene was in a Preminger movie. And definitely movies that were a little smaller in scope. He never went off the rails into full-on like sci-fi, like The Birds, like Hitchcock did. He never did.
The Birds isn't even really sci-fi, but...
Yeah, it's, I don't know, paranormal?
Yeah, that one's kind of in its own little weird category over there.
It's in its own bird box.
Yeah, don't look at it. Keep moving.
But yeah, he focuses on more personal stories. You can tell. I think this is another theatrical thing too. Is this focus on character development and character arcs, and sometimes that plays out really well. Like everyone's obsession with Laura, or watching the slow realization of the trauma experienced by Mrs. Lake in Bunny Lake is Missing, or the sly kind of winking character of Jimmy Stewart in Anatomy of a Murder. And sometimes the focus just fumbles a bit, like in Bonjour Tristesse, where everyone comes off as really whiny and not very interesting.
Yeah, Bonjour Tristesse is a tragedy of the bourgeoisie, essentially.
Yeah, the Bonjour Tristesse, the thing about that story is that it's supposed to be whiny, but like I don't know if it came off better in the book version, but like it didn't come off that interesting. It was like, oh, whiny rich people having problems. Oh no.
Yeah. Which is again why I think Le Bonheur works better, because it's really gets at the heart of what does that kind of lifestyle do to the people around you, and less, oh, I feel bad now that someone died. because of
Yeah.
my selfishness.
Yeah. I feel bad because someone died did not come off great in Bonjour Tristesse. In fact, the flashing, not the oh man, what would you call
The
it? when
whole
you flash
movie was in
forward?
flashback.
Yeah, the flash forwards, I guess, that you got in the black and white sequences were they came off even more whiny.
Yeah.
I don't even know. It felt more like she was less like the character was sad that her friend had died as a result of her actions than she was just sad that she for herself.
Yeah.
More than anything else. It was very much a pity parade all around.
And it was interesting that that they used such self-awareness and yet the character arc was still a plateau.
Yeah, it was because that stuff that they're exploring is the point, but like it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Usually, if the character
like
doesn't change, they also don't realize it, and the audience realizes it and feels bad for them. The character doesn't usually just feel bad for themselves and then keep doing the same stupid stuff.
Yeah. That one just feels like a huge misstep in the collection of movies that we're talking about today. Again, not a terrible movie, but much more of a mess than a lot of the movies we're talking about today.
Right.
Sometimes I do have to remind myself about that because we normally we focus on like the best movies possible for any topic we talk about. And sometimes when one doesn't live up to like that S or A rank standard, we're like, it's bad. And it's definitely not as good, but it's normally not as trash. There's very few that are actually that bad, mostly King Kong 1970s. But I haven't made that joke in forever. But yeah, a lot of the other ones are definitely good and worth a watch or exploration if you're into that kind of thing. Of course, we should talk about the camera work because it is excellent in a lot of these movies, especially in the black and white, especially in the texture. And of course, that long take with the wandering eye. Oh man, that is some good stuff. And if you're interested in learning about black and white cinematography or how to move a camera in an interesting character motivated way, then Preminger is a good character or good body of work to study.
Oh my gosh, Alex. Random fun fact.
Okay.
The main dude, the psycho brother from Bunny Lake is Missing, is Dave from 2001.
Is it?
It is.
Oh. You know what it is, isn't it?
So yeah, he got his comeuppance in the end, I guess.
Yeah.
Locked out of an airlock by a robot.
Computer in space to do it.
Yep. But yeah, and again, it's really hard to kind of analyze Preminger in a bubble because his films don't exist in a bubble, and that's really what our podcast is about.
Nothing exists in a bubble. That's the problem.
Yeah, that's why we like to talk about many films at a time as opposed to spending an hour and a half on one movie, because the way that we perceive film is influenced by the other films that we see and the other films that were made before and after it and all those kind of things. And so it's as much as it kind of may feel like we're disparaging Preminger by saying that Hitchcock did it first or did it better a lot of times, you still have to watch Preminger with Hitchcock in mind, because the people who were watching Preminger when Preminger was making films were thinking of Hitchcock. Preminger was thinking of Hitchcock when he was making films because they were making films at the same time. And so, and of course, there's lots of other influences and stuff. Those are just some of the comparisons that we saw that seem the most blatant because they are very starkly similar.
They're very close. Yeah. If you're familiar with both bodies of works, the similarities are very evident.
But still, being compared to Hitchcock is kind of a compliment in its own right. Like, I know that's kind of a backhanded compliment a lot of times to say that imitation is the purest form of flattery, but still, like, you're following in Hitchcock's footsteps. It's hard to go wrong in that area.
Saying this guy makes movies like Hitchcock is not a mean thing to say, is it? Like, it's pretty complimentary, right?
Basically,
if someone came up to
you
like
and
Hitchcock
said, hey, and you want more of it, follow up with Preminger.
Your movie you made reminded me of a Hitchcock movie. I would be so flattered, like you don't even understand. Like, I think anybody would be very flattered. Like that would be awesome. Yeah. Anything else to talk about Otto Preminger in general, Jonathan?
I don't think so. I'm sure his name will pop up later on the podcast. So now
it's nice as we talk about more and more people over the years to have a broader and broader context to draw on every time we examine a new topic or a new creator or something of that matter. Because every time we go back into the big pile of films that exist, like you said, it's all connected. Nothing exists in a bubble, and we gain more and more scope about the stuff we research, and it becomes far more interesting every time we go back in. But speaking about expanding that bubble, Jonathan, what are we talking about next time on the podcast?
Next time, or maybe past time? I don't know. Yeah. We're talking about time travel movies. And this list is going to make a lot of you upset. I'm sorry. There are a lot of time travel movies, guys.
There's so many. There's so many.
We're picking...
Yeah, we tried to pick movies based off of different types of time travel and how that can affect different structures of movies and stuff like that. We try to pick good examples of different sorts of that.
And we're having fun with some stuff that people know about so they can follow along. But the first one is a little more obscure. We're talking Time After Time from 1979, followed by the classic Back to the Future from 1985, followed by another classic, Groundhog Day from 1993. And because how could we not include Christopher Nolan, we are talking about Tenet from 2020.
We've already done Memento. If you're wondering, we've covered Memento back on like the original Nolan cast, which was in one of the first 5 episodes we've covered on the
and technically, technically Memento is not a time travel movie. I'll say that too.
That's the other thing too. It's not technically time travel. It messes with the structure of time.
Perceived time, but not actual time.
Because after all editing is time travel, and all movies are time travel.
Guys, you don't even know how philosophical we're gonna get next time. We already started in a podcast that we recorded in the future.
Yeah. Well, time travel is just such an integral, fundamental conceit to the art of telling a story or to the art of filmmaking that we're going to be talking about the movies that specifically acknowledge time travel and use it as part of their plot conceit, but it will inevitably become a meta discussion about film overall. And, we managed to mix in some good ones. We've got a cult classic in Time After Time. We've got 2, as I call them, dad classics, Back to the Future and Groundhog Day, and then a newer blockbuster in Tenet.
Yep. And before we wrap up, we do need to plug a few things. So we have a Patreon. If you would like to support us, you can go over there and check that out. Anyone can join us on the Discord channel, but if you support us on Patreon, you also get things like being able to listen to the show live and getting the bonus podcast. And the last bonus podcast that we talked about, we covered Our Gang / The Little Rascals, which started in 1922 and has kind of been a force of kind of cultural relevance and referenceability. A little bit less so lately because it's been a while since they made a Little Rascals movie, but
mostly through the 20th century.
People still understand what you're talking about when you talk about the Little Rascals. And so it all started 100 years ago. And we talked about some of that, and we're talking time travel coming up. We've got lots of stuff over there. So if you would like to listen to more of us rambling, support us on Patreon.
That is about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 433 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter @thefilmlings.
Summaries for this week's episode were recorded by me, Jason Harden. You can find me on Twitter @TheBlueJay1994.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Based on a 1958 novel of the same name, written by Michigan Supreme. Oh, was like, that's a weird name.
It sounds like a Transformer name. Michigan Supreme. I'll crush you, Optimus Prime.
Oh my gosh. Okay, line breaks save lives.